Can everyone hear me all right? I'd love to thank Rada and everyone for this amazing opportunity. My name is Katherine Peil Kauffman, and my professional mission in life has been to understand the emotional system, from clinical and social psychology through biology, down to the underlying chemistry and physics. Some of my guiding questions have been, why do we have feelings? What is their biological function? Why do they come in two categories? Those that feel good, like joy, trust, gratitude. Those that feel bad, like fear, sadness, and hate. And mostly, why is it that emotion, both our good and bad feelings, are ground zero for some of the very best and the very worst of human behavior? So the answers that I've found change a lot of what we think we know about emotion, about life, and about ourselves, and particularly how emotion operates as a core driver of behavior on both individual and collective levels. Well, so we have limited time today. I hope you'll forgive me for offering just a series of the most relevant sound bites, beginning with the key take-homes from my own emotion work. Okay. Got a little thing here. First, as my title suggests, emotion is an ancient sensory system rooted in simple binary bodily feelings of pleasure and pain. Second, feelings deliver evaluative information, informing original forms of adaptive mind. Third, feelings automatically move and protect the body, driving the ubiquitous hedonic pattern of behavior evident across the entire kingdom of animals, toward that which is beneficial and away from that which is harmful. Fourth, feelings serve the ancient evolutionary function of self-regulation, constructing, stabilizing, integrating, and expanding all aspects of self-identity. The emotional system is nothing less than an innate behavioral guidance system that has been historically opaque to science. So understanding our emotional biology can shed light on much of our misguided behavior, both at individual and collective levels. Indeed, Stewart and many others have told us about our dire situation with the Anthropocene, emphasizing our runaway global economy as a central driver. Stu explained how we're poised for a transition in science beyond the reductionism, determinism, and mechanism of the Newtonian paradigm, much of which preempted deeper investigations into our emotional nature. Newtonian determinism cannot explain our active agency, the intelligent doing behavior of animals. They suggest the suggestion that there's some sort of information processing, even free will, and some sort of subjective experience. But to my mind, the damage was done much earlier than Newton. I would start with this guy, René Descartes, grandfather of the machine metaphor, as well as empiricism, rationalism, and much of Enlightenment thinking. Despite his brilliance, he misled us in two key ways. First, his empiricism was largely observation and description, ignoring actions in the world necessary for survival and adaptation, foraging for food, avoiding predators, building niches. But perhaps worse was the dualistic identity structure with a ghost-like mind separate from yet interacting with a machine-like body. This gave birth to a traditional rationalism that credited the mind as the higher source of reason, goodness, and even personal identity. I think, therefore I am. Demoting emotion to the lowly machine-like body, perhaps even fallen, animal instinct, and the dark, dirty Freudian subconscious. So these foundational assumptions echoed across our 20th century social sciences, and certainly in James Watson's original science, behaviorism. Living creatures became just hardwired bodies, responding directly to environmental cues as stimulus response instinct machines. By design, the mind was left out. It was an unknowable black box. There was no mention of emotion, which they soon had to smuggle back into the story due to Ivan Pavlov's discovery of associative learning, classical and operant conditioning, which undergird all learning through the application of external punishments and rewards that tapped into an unconditioned stimulus-response pair, which was actually our hardwired approach and avoidant responses to pleasure and pain. But perhaps the most tragic misstep is known as the naturalistic fallacy, the idea from George Moore that no values can be found in nature, that you can't get an ought from an is, and specifically that to explain the good in terms of natural properties like pleasure or desire is false. Now, this is most ironic because Moore was misinterpreting the words of David Hume, who himself grounded evaluative meaning in emotion, our moral sentiments, as he called them. But he made the same mistake as Descartes by ignoring doing behavior and the fact that one can be doing something well or bungle the job, which is instrumental ought right there. So surely being alive or dead connotes value to living systems. Oops. Fortunately, did I do that right? The complexity science has paved a conceptual path forward, moving us from machines to systems, from parts to wholes, and especially from quantity to quality, where we will find the self-regulatory function of emotion rooted in the self-organizing dynamics of complex adaptive systems. So again, with your forgiveness, I'll offer the sound bites of how complexity science puts a new spin on both our puzzling and neglected features of life. So the requirements of our new story paradigm. First is a more nuanced concept of identity, because emotional information always concerns some aspect of self-identity. It's our self-regulatory information. Identity is reframed as a nested fractal structure with a special organization and functional closure that affords distributed control at both local and global levels. Second, we need a rethinking of boundaries in light of the openness of non-equilibrium systems in their local environment and the biological relativity of those environments across levels of scale in time and space. Third, factoring in self-regulated behavior as both causal and creative, whether it's computational or thermodynamic work. Fourth, the question of subjectivity in terms of feedback, cybernetic feedback signals, biosemiotic signaling, and self-making autopoiesis and inactive forms of cognition. Finally, and most importantly, values, simple rules for life, and how good and bad feelings inform us of universally right states, delivering semantic value, teleological purpose, emergent from edge of chaos criticality, which we haven't heard much about yet. So these pieces come together in a new way of thinking about identity. And Stu talked about this. It's a special structure he refers to as the Kantian whole, where the parts exist for and by means of the whole. All living systems are such Kantian wholes, like this set of Russian nesting dolls, stacked one inside the other. Each eukaryotic cell, for example, collectively forming the tissue of a specific organ, say a liver, collectively united into an organ system, say by brain, all inside one body that's moving about, constantly interacting with its local environment. So this new flat fractal identity is much better aligned with how our biology defines the self in dynamic self-organizing systems, as well as self, not self distinctions required in genetics, epigenetics, and immune regulatory processes. There's plenty more to say here about that special kind of closure. It's variously known as constraint, organizational, and informational closure, but for our purposes of the self-regulatory discussion, there are two key pieces. First, identity itself at a network level has both dual aspects, as an autonomous me as a whole, and a we as a part of a greater whole. So it's this identity itself within each level of a Kantian whole. Second, that the bidirectional information flows are born of couplings of positive and negative feedback loops that deliver binary logic that is common across each level. So, the take-homes here from Complexity About Emotion is that feelings themselves serve as feedback signals concerning the self-relevant changes in either internal or external worlds that require immediate action. Feelings carry a common binary logic. Its values, ultimately rooted in what's known as the edge of chaos criticality, where computation, information processing, and sensitivity are all said to originate. So semantic values that are applied in our self-regulatory emotional nature concern a bistable balancing act between order and disorder at each level across the self system. Feelings provide both simple rules and nearest neighbor information, providing behavioral guidance at both individual and collective levels. Dual aspects. I know this is a lot to take in, and again, for your forgiveness, let's turn back to the science of behavior as it is today. And this time, we'll look at the well-known concept of the OODA loop, which is now used to understand and guide both group and individual behavior everywhere, from business leadership to military operations. OODA is an acronym for an ongoing decision-making cycle proceeding through the 4 steps of observe, orient, decide, and act. The goal is to continually learn and adapt in ways that keep the best match between internal and external environments, the most accurate mental mapping between immediate needs and actual events and features of the real world. To proceed through the cycle quickly, one can act optimally and even gain a competitive advantage and get inside the OODA loop of an opponent. So, in the context of the old behaviorism, the first 3 steps of the OODA loop, observe, orient, and decide, are tasks of the old black box mind. Building just such an artificial mind is now the design challenge of artificial intelligence, the goal being to build a robot that can observe, orient, and decide, as well as act with some degree of general intelligence, despite an ever-changing environment. For example, a creature can spot a sudden predator, say a bear in the woods, and instantly run away. Designers build fancy sensors to observe the outside world and use big data and probability matching to decide, and actuators to act. But how to orient remains a problem, even with the best deep learning neural networks. This is also known as the frame problem. Which features of the environment to observe as relevant? And while wonderfully Cartesian, robots cannot adapt. The logic is all syntax with no semantics. As Luke Steele told us, something is clearly missing. However, nature solved all these problems long ago by embodying living systems with some simple binary semantic sensation. In one fell swoop, pleasure or pain calls attention to self-relevant environmental features and orienting observation of good or bad environmental affordances, threats, and opportunities. That's an evaluative decision. And it moves the body to act, all 4 steps. Now, I'm not claiming emotional sentience solves the hard problem of consciousness. That's a different discussion about the fundamental capacity to observe. But in this new view, notice that the mind has lost its job. We're back to just a body responding in its world. Where did the mind go? As it turns out, an inactive, autopoietic mind emerges from the emotion-driven OODA loop to the degree that there is some memory of the behavioral response, which we find even at the level of the simple bacterium. Instead, when we examine the sensory motor chemistry of the bacterium, we see an early cybernetic behavioral control loop, physically instantiated on its cell membrane, where binary feelings run the entire autopoietic show, beginning with an ongoing comparison between self and not self, between inside and outside worlds, detecting external stimulus from heat, ions, peptides, sucrose, and even single photons that signal self-relevant imbalances that trigger self-corrections. The feeling signal provides both stimulus and response, driving real-time behavior via a phosphorylation signal, then feeding back via a methylation mark, establishing evaluative memories on a longer time scale, which paved the way for associative learning. This simple circuit delivers what Dennis Bray calls infotaxis, consistently moving the critter toward and away from environmental features that are good or bad in terms of survival and adaptation. So here we have both self-reference and the origins of mind long before brains emerged on the evolutionary stage. We also have 3 out of the 4 types of autopoiesis that Luke Steele's told us about. No brains required, only membranes. And these same mechanisms on the cell membrane are still in use, undergirding cell signaling cascades within multicellular organisms. But when brains did come on the scene, the binary information component in emotion began to complexify and diversify with some of the 5 basic emotions, which are joy, sadness, fear, anger, and disgust, apparent as early as reptiles. I want to point out that 4 out of 5 of these basic emotions are painful. Some people think this might be a throwback or a defect, but actually, with this new science, it's because nature is giving us 4 times as much information about what to reduce, to avoid, to prevent in our external and internal environments. It's only with mammals that we begin to see much more of an elaboration of the one basic emotion that feels good, which is joy. But then we begin to see all kinds of beautiful things like social bonding, cooperation, play, and the emergence of complex emotions like wonder and courage and, well, that's us mostly. Anyway, this evolution of emotion is also reflected in the triune structure of the human brain. So we have all 3 of these levels of information, and they each tell us different things about integrating and optimizing the self. This trend is also evident in Maslow's needs hierarchy and in Erikson's stage models of psychosocial child development. Plus, we also see evidence of the dual identity, that Kantian me and we, that part and whole, all the way up. From the very beginning at the bacterial level, there's quorum sensing, using just slightly fancier peptides to know when there's enough of self in the external environment. So they can get together and cooperate in balling up against antibiotics or take launch on a virulent launch on a competitive species. So that's a really key point here about identity and how it plays out in our emotions. So Hume had it right with moral sentiments. Darwin had it right about the role of emotion in both adaptive behavior and group selection. He talked about altruism and moral instincts for the good of the community. But so was Lamarck about the role of immediate behavior that's driven by felt needs and what we know about epigenetics now. But so was Henri Bergson with his notion of élan vital. For although discredited by the mechanists who won most of the arguments, it turns out that the emotional system itself is the physical mechanism that instantiates both the animation and guidance once attributed to an identity structure called spirit or soul. And who are we to assume knowledge of the ultimate boundaries of our fractal identity structure, our creative potentials we have yet to self-actualize? So here we have a summary of exactly what what this tells us about values. What does it say about good and bad and right and wrong? Good and bad are about optimal self-regulation. They're about a balance between stability and growth. Remember, this came from positive and negative coupling of feedback dynamics, something that's been missing, which is why we're doing this amplification. There are no negative feedbacks, and yet we have them. 4 times as much information about what to reverse, trends to reverse. So pleasure and pain both push and pull us to maintain an optimal balance between chaos and order, between growth and protection. Ongoing development of mind, which means growth is really about expansion of the mind, expansion of the world that you can get about in. And mostly, as Peter Singer says, it's expansion of empathic boundaries to include more and more and more of our social other. That's the primary form of growth that's going on here, and that's what we see in complexity. So I just want to say, and wrong is failing to do any of that. But I want to note that there's no us versus them in this story, because that's ultimately a conflict between the 2 aspects of identity that are part of all living systems, because they're part of complex systems. And there is no good and evil in this story. That's a false dichotomy that has been used to dehumanize and divide and hijack people's OODA loops, by the way. Also, too, what we do see in this new story is a radical egalitarian justice for the rights of all living systems and a radical accountability to nature's self-regulatory imperatives and simple rules. Life is trial and error, and we have feedback in every moment to tell us. We cannot know how life will unfold, for as Kierkegaard said, we live life forward, but we understand it backward. That's why our feedback signals are so important to know how we're on track or not. We come equipped with a natural flow of ongoing self-relevant feedback information there at the ready every moment of every day, lurking in our common everyday feelings. But we have evil. We have actually inverted the logic. We have not understood what the 4 basic pains are asking us to do, and we've allowed an elaboration of complex negative emotions to take root in our minds and in our cultures. Johan talked a little bit about distorted beliefs, faulty beliefs. And mostly, if there's any evil in this story, it's backward living because we're off track. So historically, we missed the boat and on the guidance system, particularly our distress signals, which is what negative emotions are. We have missed the self-corrective message and been blaming the messenger, associating our lower emotion and animal instinct with it, or even associating with evil. In fact, several of the 7 deadly sins are emotions. We've inverted the logic at every level. We've normalized ever more complex, like I said. We have the distress signals. Normalized ever more complex negative emotions like anxiety, shame, resentment, contempt, envy, hate. These are distress signals of an underdeveloped and misguided mind. And we've actually increased the conditions immeasurably. There's a whole sphere of man-made distress, which is a lot of why a lot is going wrong here with epidemic depression and all of that. So that's pretty negative. But there is hope, because Western science ignored value, doing, and emotion. The great religious traditions have not. So, although they missed out on motion too, and there's a lot of mistaken stuff there, the common strand across all spiritual traditions comes back to a collection of complex positive emotions: love, gratitude, respect, egalitarian, unity. We have that wonderful transcendent experience where we feel greater than the self. Our emotions, simple little joy, has pulled us toward self-development. That's what this is really about. In fact, Darwin was right, because pleasure and pain are a subjective reflection of the criteria for natural selection. Positive emotion is about optimal adaptation and growth. And it's when you look at the underlying force of in self-organizing systems where you see this increased complexity, that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's the right kind of growth. It's not about more stuff. It's not about a GBT where we're making stuff and we're consuming way more food than we need because we're driven by so much negative emotion. It's about right states of being and becoming. You see all through the traditions, these common strands that lead back to the one power of complex positive emotion. Now, there's one thing I do want to say. If there is a golden rule, there's a new one that I call the emerald rule of morality. It is, do not do unto others that which causes you pain. Because pleasure is very malleable and personal, and there's lots of flexibility and freedom, but pain is universal. There's 4 very clear things our negative emotions basically tell us to do, and if we're not doing those things, we're going to have a whole lot of trouble. So, I'm sorry, I'm probably running over here, but don't get me going. So, who's that guy? As Stuart suggests, we are at a third transition in science. The emerging of a new paradigm suggests we're really of nature, not above nature. We are, in fact, active, integral participant, co-creators, endowed not only with legitimate degree of free will, whatever that may be, but the guidance to use it optimally. The co-evolving biosphere, econosphere, and our noosphere across vast scales in space and time truly are the coevolution of nested Kantian wholes, bigger and bigger and bigger collections of self and how we understand our very identity. These from soil to our collective soul. These are the self-actualizing fruits of our universal preference to pursue ever more complex emotional rewards. So armed with this new understanding of integrated identity, organizational dynamism, self-regulatory imperatives, and simple rules, we can now begin to consider creating global structures, laws, and capacities that evoke, invite, and enable global citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you so much.